Welcome everyone again in the Monday Majlis of the Center for the Study of Islam, etc. And it's my greatest delight to start this one, which is dedicated to the person and scholarship of Dwight Reynolds. And I actually wrote down a couple of minutes ago what I wanted to say about him. So I will kind of read it. When I had the privilege to meet Dwight about a decade ago, I knew that he was the supervisor I was looking for when I planned to write my dissertation on Tarab Andalusi, so that the Moroccan classical music. I decided to have a supervisor like him, but I couldn't find one, so hence came Ibn al-Mukaffa into my studies. And so he combines ethnography with history, music with literature. He plays music and loves the arts. And he's such an engaging gentleman, as the heroes, as these music and art making heroes he writes about, the Ziryabs and co. So the reason why I couldn't find someone like him is that he's not only one of the leading scholars in the field, he's also a pioneer in the field. So if we have scholars now in the field, that's due very much due to his work and his qualities also as a teacher. I never studied with him, but I know how good he must be as a teacher, not just seeing his former students, but also I had this experience with him that he's someone who is an amazing performer, an amazing speaker, but he's also an amazing listener. So he likes to listen to people and engage with them, which is a very impressive human quality. Now, okay, so I'm most happy to mute myself, and it's with the greatest delight that I give the word to Dwight.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. I have to say I was a little wary of accepting an invitation to talk about myself, my life, etc., before the presentation of the research that I wanted to present, but Istvan has been very persuasive and has convinced me that it's okay. Some of you know that I've worked on medieval autobiography, where, of course, modesty and humility was the great virtue. The danger in asking me to talk about anything, of course, as my dissertation advisor once said, after noting that I'm 6'5", and that I studied a poem that's 140 hours long, and that my first dissertation draft was over 1,000 pages, he declared me to be genetically pre-programmed for length. So I will try not to fall into that trap and try to reduce this story. But I agree that it is actually very interesting especially to talk about people perhaps of my generation and older who ended up in Arabic studies, because I think almost no one had a straight path. Because Arabic studies, as I was growing up, did not have nearly the sort of prominent place that it has had in the last 2 decades, at least in the United States. So I'll just say that I was born and raised in California, and I very early on had an interest in both music and language. I took the usual middle school Spanish and started, high school French. But I am so old that when I was in high school is when Leonid Brezhnev came to power in the Soviet Union, and we started talking about détente and cultural exchange with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and suddenly they started offering Russian in my high school, which was the most exciting thing to happen to me, I think, in high school. So I immediately signed up for Russian, and I might have gone on in Russian studies, except that I got accepted on a high school exchange program. And like, any American kid who really didn't know anything about Europe, I dreamed of being sent to Paris, or maybe Italy, or perhaps Switzerland or something like that. And when they called me up and they said, "We have a host family for you," and I asked where, and they said, "Sweden." I have to say, Sweden had not figured prominently on my list of places I would love to go as an exchange student. And I sort of said, okay, and I accepted, which I'm very glad I did, because I had an absolutely wonderful time in Sweden. Swedish is my second language. I finished high school in Sweden, did not come back to the United States. I started doing university studies in Sweden. And also, to show my age, I will say this is the very end of the Vietnam War. And most Swedes, finding out that I was a young American, welcomed me with open arms, because I was clearly a draft dodger trying to avoid Vietnam. And then I would sort of bashedly say, actually, I'm a high school exchange student, and their interest level would drop. And they say, oh, all right. But in any case, I did, stay on in Sweden. And then I had an opportunity to follow my dream and get to Paris. I did a stage, an internship in a maritime insurance company in Paris. And I can tell you, working on maritime insurance contracts is one of the most boring jobs one could possibly have. But it allowed me to live in Paris and study Paris in the evening at the Alliance Francaise and that. So I did that for a while and traveled around Europe. Now I'd been in Europe for a couple of years and was interested in the Middle East, but wasn't quite sure how to get there. I applied for a job in Iran with an American company, got the job, but then a few weeks before I was supposed to leave, the job fell through. And they sent me this amazing thing that as I was probably 21 or 22 at this point, I didn't even know this existed. It was called a severance check. That is a check, a payment that they sent me because they had canceled the job, they had canceled the contract. And suddenly I had a couple of $1,000s, which if you're thinking back to 74, 75, that was probably $5,000 or $10,000. So I traveled all over Europe and eventually through various sort of crooked paths in that, I found out about being a volunteer on a kibbutz in Israel where I could get essentially paid to study Hebrew on the Ulpan program. So I went off to Israel and I thought I was going for a month or two and spent a year and a half on a kibbutz and went up, studied all my Hebrew, slowly realized that I was in the Middle East. Growing up as a kid in California, probably the only thing I knew about Middle East was the movie Exodus. And so I decided that I wanted to explore the other side. And so I moved to Jerusalem, where I got a job working in a French Catholic hospice for physically and mentally handicapped children. And working essentially with Palestinian Christians who work at this Catholic hospice. After I'd volunteered for a month, the Mother Superior called me into her office. I have to say she looked suspiciously like the Mother Superior in The Sound of Music, but I figured out later that it wasn't the same person. And she said, Dwight, you are such a help to us. You can speak English with the international donors and organizations that come through. You can speak Hebrew with the Israeli authorities. You can speak French with the nuns. The only people you can't speak to are the people who actually work here, who are Palestinian Christians, and these are the people who were cooks and cleaners and things like that, so didn't have a particularly high level of education. And she said, if you stay on for a year, we'll pay for you to study Arabic, and we'll consider your Arabic study hours work hours. So, okay, pay me to study another language. It was great. So I ended up spending over a year there, and that was my first exposure to Arabic. Then with a crazy Canadian friend, this is now, we're getting into 77, 78. This is before the Iranian Revolution and things like that. And people traveled easily on the overland route between essentially Australia and New Zealand up home to England by land. And so we said, let's fly to Istanbul and hitchhike to Indonesia, which we did. It took a few months longer than what we expected. And we didn't always hitchhike. We did take buses and trains where necessary and things like that. But, eventually, finished this fantastic trip, this kaleidoscope of different cultures and languages and money and all different types of currencies, and eventually got home and I was accepted at UCLA. And I thought, I like languages, maybe I'll do linguistics. And then I found out that linguists don't actually want to talk languages. They only want to study them. And I said, okay, this is not working out. And so I went to a counselor. They actually had living in-person counselors back then. And I sat in this woman's office and she looked at me and she said, so you're not Jewish and you're not Arab, but you speak Hebrew and you speak Arabic. And I said, yes. And she said, have we got a major for you, Middle Eastern Studies? And so I started doing Middle Eastern Studies, or Near Eastern Languages and Cultures and Civilizations, as it was at UCLA. Had great teachers. I studied with Sigurd Bonnebacher, Claude Audebert, Mohammed Isa, others. But I wasn't entirely convinced that I wanted to do the Middle East. So I did a double major in Japanese. And the difference was that I was in second year Arabic and there were 3 of us, and I was in first year Japanese and there were 180 of us. And eventually I began to see the light, but that was clinched by getting a CASA fellowship in 1980 to study in Cairo. And of course I couldn't continue Japanese there and focused entirely on Arabic. My interest in music had gone all the way through my life, and so when I was there in Cairo, I decided, oh, well, I want to study some Middle Eastern music, and I took private oud lessons and music lessons, and came back for another year at UCLA, and that's when I met my mentor, Ali Jihad Rasi, a wonderful professor of Middle Eastern ethnomusicology, who encouraged me, and I met my friend and colleague of many, many years, Scott Marcus, who teaches ethnomusicology here at UC Santa Barbara. And as it turns out, I got another CASA fellowship to go back on the CASA 2 program. And he was doing his dissertation research on music and music theory in Cairo at the same time. So I got to follow along with him and meet a number of many famous musicians that he was working with, and we actually began performing. So we've had a little trio, 3 Americans, and then the sister of a friend of ours was a singer. So we formed this little quartet, this little taht, as we would say in Arabic, and we went around performing for different, basically expat organizations. So we performed at RC, the American Research Center in Egypt. We performed at the American Embassy. We performed at all these different places. So not so much for Egyptian audiences, although occasionally there were Egyptians who were sort of wowed by the idea that these foreigners were so serious about studying Arab music that they were actually performing it. And that year as well, I also stumbled upon, through a wonderful mentor, Abdul Hamid Hawes, who taught folklore, stumbled upon the Sirat Bani Hilal, the Bani Hilal epic, which my colleague who now teaches at UCLA, Susan Slimovich, was also interested in. She did her dissertation, was a couple of years ahead of me, so she was doing her dissertation work in the south of Egypt on this oral epic tradition. And so Abdul Hamid Hawes steered me north to the Delta, and that eventually did in fact become my, my dissertation. When I came back from all of that, I was trying to figure out, I really decided I want to study this oral epic. And I tried applying to different Middle Eastern studies programs across the country, and they basically, sort of didn't like my idea. I won't say which school, but the chair of one Middle Eastern Studies department said, well, we don't really do oral literature. Perhaps you should come do a PhD in linguistics, and you could do a dissertation on the morphology of the dialect you were interested in, and then later on you could study the poetry. This did not fly. Eventually, however, I was turned on to the fact that I could do something like, linguistic anthropology or folklore. And in fact, I ended up in the folklore program, doing a PhD in folklore at the University of Pennsylvania, which also had wonderful professors of Arabic, such as Roger Allen, George Makdisi. So great training there. And then I went off and lived in a village in Egypt for a year and did my dissertation work. And part of that was that I apprenticed myself to a poet and learned to play the rabab and learned to recite a little bit of the epic. And so I made a bit of a career for myself, performing little bits and pieces of the epic, at different places, such as the Mesa conferences. And I once was invited to perform at the United Nations as a guest star from the League of Arab Nations, the Arab League. And anyway, so I only perform a little tiny bit. As I said, the whole thing is between 100 and 140 hours long. But I eventually wrote my dissertation on that. And oddly enough, that is what led me in part to Andalusian music, because when I was in Cairo and studying music, a lot of people, my music professors all said, oh, if you really want to understand Arab music, and if you want to understand the modal system, what you have to do is study these old muashahat, that these are sort of the classical tradition. And so I had studied a lot of that in Cairo. And suddenly in 1990, there was a conference held in Algeria on the Bani Hilal tribe in history and folk literature, في تاريخ والأدب الشعبي. And I was invited, Susan Simovich was also invited. And so I started reading up on Algeria, say, well, I certainly want to travel around a little bit, once I'm there. And I sort of stumbled upon this amazing city, Tlemcen, which most of you have heard of, or something, which is sort of close to the Moroccan border, which has been known for its musical traditions going back a couple of centuries. And among those traditions is the Andalusian musical tradition. And sure enough, when I got to Tlemcen, there was a little tiny tourist office, and I wandered in, and they gave me a map. And there were all of these treble clefs, these musical symbols scattered over the map of the city. And I asked what those were, and they said, well, each one of those is a jama'iyya, or an association, right, devoted to Andalusian music. And so it turned out there were 6 different institutions that taught Andalusian music and had youth orchestras and adult orchestras. So this is in a town of less than 100,000, right, at that time. So it was really astonishing. So I said, I'm coming back next year to do a documentary video on your wonderful Andalusian music tradition. I'm going to wrap this up really quickly because I think I've taken too much time. But so I did come back the following year. I had a grant, and I had a video camera, and I had a suitcase full of videotapes and also, all prepared and all that. And I landed in Algiers, and I didn't want to go to one of the tourist hotels. So I went into one of the hotels that was sort of closer to the Bab El Oued, if you know that section of town, and went to sleep. At about 3 a.m., there was this horrendous noise. And I just jumped up out of bed, wrapped a towel around myself, and went out I was on the 3rd floor, and went out onto my balcony to see what was going on. And there was a, column of military vehicles moving up the street alongside my hotel. And I was sort of looking at this, trying to figure out what was going on. And I looked across the street at the people on the same floor, so, only 20 or 30 yards apart away from me. And I looked at this guy, what was he doing? And I said, oh my God, he's lighting a Molotov cocktail, which he lit and tossed down. I promptly decided that I was not appropriately dressed for the occasion. And went back into my room, put on my clothes, ran downstairs, and they were herding all of the guests from the hotel into this one part of the lobby that did not face onto any of the side streets. And we all spent the night there, huddled together, listening to what was happening outside. And of course, this is the beginning of very serious problems in Algeria in the 1990s. I did make it out to Tlemcen eventually, but there was going to be a festival. The festival was canceled. So there I was in Tlemcen. So I said, teach me a nuba, teach me a whole, suite of Andalusian music. And so I worked with the organization called Ahbab Shikl Arabi bin Sari, and they taught me their version of Nubat Zidan, which is what they were planning on performing at the festival that had been canceled because people couldn't fly in. There were restrictions in the airport, so people from Tunisia and Morocco and different countries couldn't come in. And I stayed there till it was safe to leave and studied this, and came back to UCSB. And in 1992, and the 500th anniversary of the fall of Granada in 1492, the UCSB Middle East Ensemble, under the direction of Maestro Scott Marcus and with myself, performed a Nubat Zidan, Andalusian music fresh from Tlemcen. All of that led me to, be more and more interested in Andalusian music. I couldn't go back to Algeria, so I began to go to different places. I went to Morocco, I went to Syria, I went to Lebanon, collecting information about Andalusian music. And then suddenly I was offered the position of being the University of California representative of Education Abroad program in Granada, Spain, and therefore an adjunct professor at the University of Granada. So I was there for 3 years. I actually taught what we believe to be the first doctoral course on the history of Andalusian music ever taught in Spain. That produced the book that I recently published that I'll talk about, The Musical Heritage of Al-Andalus, and also a second book of translations. And the presentation I'm making today is sort of an expansion out of that research. I hope I haven't gone on too long or too quickly. I'll catch my breath. And Shale Istvan, can I go ahead and start the presentation?
Of course, I would have been happy to listen to your story for another 5 minutes, because that's what we won't get from anywhere else. But of course, I'm most happy to go ahead.
All right. Well, I'm happy to take questions on any or all of that. But yes, please, let's go ahead and we will actually go to this presentation. So here we go. Do I have this is right? Everybody can see this? Okay. So, the Exeter Majlis, what a thrill to be with you all. And Istvan, thank you so much for the invitation. And let's see, there we go. This talk is called Behind Enemy Lines, Muslim and Jewish Musicians in Christian Realms. I should say this is Christian realms in Iberia. So we are talking about the Iberian Peninsula here. I recently published these two books, The Musical Heritage of Al-Andalus, and that is the first volume of a 2-volume sequence set, I hope, tracing the origins of this music that we call Andalusi, Andalusian, and as you probably tell from my autobiography, if you don't know, this is still performed all over the Middle East, or many different urban centers. And in some places it's very, very popular, and like in Algeria, it's very popular among young people. In other places like Morocco, it's a little more, well, this is sort of a classical tradition. It has a certain audience, but maybe not listened to so much by 20-year-olds. In other places like Cairo, it used to be a big part of the repertory performed by orchestras and is now sort of fading. In other places like Syria, if you talk about Sabah Fakhri, or in Damascus or Halab, I mean, this is a very important thing. So it has a different social role everywhere it's found. It's also found in Israel. There are actually, now they're back to one. There was one Andalusian orchestra in Israel, then they split and formed two, and now I think there's only one. Then I published translations of primary texts in this other book, Medieval Arab Music and Musicians. This includes the biography of Ibrahim al-Mawsili from the Kitab al-Ghani, al-Isfahani. If you have ever heard of the famous singer Ziryab, there's a chapter in the Musical Heritage of Al-Andalus that traces how Ziryab became a legend, and the biography, the biggest biography of him, sort of the original text, if you will, is translated. But let me also call out Carl Davila, who's here with us today, because his work has also dealt with Ziryab. So you can see another similar treatment where you can get different details than I've chosen to use in mine. But if you have heard of him, then you probably want to take a look at all 3 of our books. But in doing this research, I came up with a problem. And here is the problem. The medieval Arabic sources about music in Al-Andalus are almost entirely focused on the elite music of the court. And we do have little tiny references here and there. We know that there was a broader, more diverse musical life in Al-Andalus, and that intersected and exchanged with musical life in the Christian kingdoms of Al-Andalus. The problem is that Arabic sources don't give much information about this. We do have, I've given you, these are the sort of 3 main examples we have of non-elite performances. In Shirwani's Hadiqat al-Afrah, there is a wonderful description, which I've translated and included in my book, of a musical garden party in 1015 in Malaga. There is in Ibn Hayyan's Al-Muqtabis a fascinating reference, and I want to thank Maribel Fierro for sending this reference to me, about a woman named Jamila, the sister of Mahmud ibn Abd al-Jabbar, for her heroic feats in battle. right? In the Battle of Riba Alta, or Ripa Alta in Latin. And we don't know anything else about her. We just know that people at weddings sang songs about her heroic feats, which is incredibly frustrating because she sounds like a remarkable character. And there's also a brief description of music being played at a wedding in the streets of Cordoba, found in Al-Humaydi's Jadwat al-Muqtabis. But that is pretty much it. There are a handful of other references, but we don't have any sense of what's going on. One place we can look to go a little bit further than the court is the number of places where these qiyan, these are elite musically trained female slaves who are singing, sometimes called singing slave girls. My colleague Carl Davila calls them artiste slaves or artiste performance, and this is probably closer. But so we have information about performances, and we have some buying and selling, and a little bit about their training. We have a few short biographies that include their, describe their talents and include sample song compositions. But we're still staying up in the very upper class, right? Because these women were extremely expensive. So how do we get beyond this? So, so here is, there we go. Here is one image that we have from Iberia that is probably a qaina, the singular of qayan. This is from the Libro de Juegos, or the Book of Chess, that was written and published under Alfonso Sabio, Alfonso X of Castile. And we have here, women playing chess, and to the left we see this woman who is performing on the lute, and could well be one of these singing slave girls or musically trained female slaves. So it gives some sense of the image. We know that some of them were also dancers, and we did a few other things, but primarily singers and lute players. So my question is, where can we find more information about the diverse musical genres and styles of Al-Andalus? And one of the places, and what I'm going to sort of argue today, is that by looking at the textual, iconographic, and financial documentation of Muslim and Jewish musicians and dancers in Christian realms, we actually, surprisingly, get a much more detailed, much richer description of what these musicians and dancers did than by looking at Arabic sources. So, I'll just say, to begin with, I'm going to use a little bit of shorthand. I'm just going to call people Muslims and Jews because it is so complicated to work out. We have Muslims, we have Arabs, we have the Spanish term Moros, we have the English term Moors. Mudejars are Moors who are living in Christian realms. Moriscos are Moors, Muslims that were converted to Christianity in the 16th century. I'm just going to call them Muslims. Same with Jews, instead of going all through Marranos and Conversos and New Christians, etc. So please understand that this is just a shorthand, and that in any sort of more detailed context, we would have to figure out exactly what we should be calling the different people involved here. So where do we find these musicians? Where do we find Muslim and Jewish musicians in Christian-controlled territories? The answer is we find them absolutely everywhere. It's just astonishing. We find them, of course, in the courts where we would expect them, but we also find them performing in churches. And we find them performing in processions. We find them as hired as salaried municipal musicians, right? We find them performing at weddings. We find them in the short-lived independent kingdom in the Alpujarras Mountains during the Morisco Rebellion of 1568 through 71. And then we also find them in these weird pageants that Spaniards came to love, the Game of Canes and the Moros y Cristianos pageants. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of each of these different categories of musicians, just to demonstrate the richness of the documentation that we have, and then conclude with a few thoughts about what we can extrapolate from all of this. So in the court, this is where we have the most information, not surprisingly. Alfonso el Sabio, of course, is the great patron of the book, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, that has lots of images of musicians, one of our major sources, but we don't know anything about Alfonso el Sabio's court musicians. But his son, Sancho IV of Castile, in the 13th century, we have his financial records, and they have been studied by Don Ramon Menendez Pidal. And so we have just great detail, and we can see that he had 27 salaried court musicians, 13 Christians, 13 Moors or Muslims, and 1 Jewish musician. And I'll just give you a little bit of, the type of thing that we can find out about this. Ismail, the Jewish musician, played an instrument you may not have heard of, the rota, which is sort of a bowed lute, very close to the English and Welsh crowd or rote. Rashid played the shababa, the Arab flute. 2 Muslim musicians and the wife of one of them were listed as saltadores, which can mean dancers, entertainers, even acrobats, because we know that they used equipment, strangely enough. All of the other Muslim musicians are cited as playing one of or 2 different types of trumpet, the anyafil and the trompa, and all of the salaried Christian musicians played either trumpet or drum. That is, they played fanfares and they played acclamatory ceremonial music. This does not show the richness of music in Sancho's court, because the other musicians, the stars, if you will, were traveling minstrels that moved from one place to another and would come and spend a few months here and a few months there, or even a couple of years. These are his salaried, the basic background musicians in his court. But that is just absolutely the tip of the iceberg. The further we dig, myself and other scholars, the further we find that, look at this, all of these kings had Jewish and Moorish and or Muslim musicians in their court, going from the 13th century all the way into the 16th century. And there's probably much more. It's just that a lot of that work has not been done. A lot of this is very difficult work because you have to go through financial records, finding payments to musicians. And then if many times that doesn't have the name, so you don't have any idea if they were Christian or Muslim or Jewish, but they are literally everywhere. And from this, okay, as I said, we have Arabic sources about life in court, but from these records, we can find out a few new and sometimes even surprising things. Here is the most famous image of a Muslim performing in a Christian court. This is from Alfonso X El Sabio's Cantigas de Santa Maria, and we have a Moor performing with a Christian. One of the difficulties in doing this research is that oftentimes a great scholar of the past has, given a description of an image such as this, and now everybody quotes that person rather than rethinking. So again, Don Ramon Menendez y Pedal, the great Hispanist, described this as a Moorish minstrel and a Christian minstrel singing together over the jug of wine that inspired them. And I don't know how they can tell there's wine in that little jug, but almost all scholars who talk about this image talk about the jug of wine. But even more strange to me is that everybody repeats the idea that this is a Moorish and a Christian minstrel, 2 minstrels together. And when I look at this, I say, wait a minute, that Christian is clearly portrayed as a Christian, but he's wearing a sword. And there is no way a minstrel would have been wearing a sword in court, right? And so I don't even think that an artist would have chosen to, in representing a minstrel, put a sword on him, because that would be such an odd thing to do. So I think that there is a social message here that the Christian that we see here as a very upper class is a nobleman. And perhaps a social message that who is it who would be able to perform with a Muslim, perhaps even singing in Arabic together or something like that, but it would be of someone of the noble class. Here is an image of a dancer. We don't have one from Spain, but we can go across to Sicily and find in the Cappella Palatina. We know that dancers were brought up to the court. So here is one of the remarkable examples we find by studying Muslim and Jewish performers in the courts. Pedro IV of Aragon wrote in 1337 to the municipal authorities of Xàtiva, further down south, asking that they send him a certain Ali Sigua, who was a juglar, that is a minstrel or a jongleur, and a performer of the rabab, a tocador de rabab. And they sent not only Ali, but also a player of the flute, a shababa, and his name was Shahat Maskum. And they were so successful that they were incorporated into the king's household with an annual salary of 100 sueldos. So what is remarkable to me here is, first of all, we have a king, a Christian king way up in the north in Aragon, who has heard of, he doesn't want just an Arab or Muslim performer. He wants a specific star performer. He's sending hundreds of miles away to Khativa for this particular performer to come. And what is more exciting to me is that this is a performer on the Rabab, because we know that the Rabab existed in Al-Andalus, came from North Africa into Al-Andalus and then on into Europe. But we do not have a single Arabic source that talks about a performance of the Rabab, let alone a performance of the Rabab in a court. So here we finally have, we knew the instrument existed, but here we have a documentary evidence of someone performing on this instrument. And again, if we look at the Christian, so this is the Cantigas de Santa Maria, we find these images of rebabs. So again, evidence of their existence, although we didn't know that they were performed in court. If you look carefully here, you can see that the rabab is made of two different materials. This is sort of white down here and a little bit darker, metal or wood. And you can even see the sort of wastedness. There's a little tightening in the middle of the sound box. And if we look at modern Morocco, we find exactly that same musical instrument, right? Wood here, wood or metal on top, white skin, goat skin or other type of skin below, and a slight pinching or wasting at the sound box and the same bow, etc. It's really quite interesting that this instrument has survived through the centuries, and it is exclusively associated with performing Andalusian music. You do not use a rabab to perform any other type of music. Anyway, another thing that comes out of looking at these court records is we get documentation for the existence of musical families. This is, probably something that would be obvious, but on the Arabic side, we do not have a single reference to families of musicians. One family that we can trace for about 25 years is the Al-Khulai or Fulani family from Valencia, who performed in the court of Aragon many times, and they performed for 3 different consecutive kings of Aragon. And the letters from the kings refer to these musicians by their first names. He sends, the letter says, send me Murad and his wife and his daughter. And, so they're really on a very close, first name basis with the court of Aragon. If we look up in Navarra, up in the Pyrenees Mountains, we find a famous family of Jewish minstrels, the Bonafos of Tudela, his son, and then as late as 1426, we still have a performer by the name of Boniface, which is probably the same family. And, we know how much money they were paid. So we have evidence for families of musicians. Okay, so let's put aside the courts and now look at a rather surprising thing, and that is the hiring of Muslim and Jewish performers, musicians, and dancers to perform inside churches during what were called vigils, right, that were held all night long. Supposedly in preparation for different big festivals. But in 1322, the council in Valladolid explicitly forbade the hiring of Muslim and Jewish musicians to perform in these vigils. And of course, there's nothing better to prove that something is going on than when people say there's a law against it. So we don't know how much further back this practice goes, but by 1322, it was so common that the council felt that they had to pass a law, and that did not stop it happening at all. The law was, all of it continued to be broken, for a couple of centuries. Some of you may know the figure of Don Juan Manuel, a nephew of Alfonso X, and the author of a very famous collection of short stories, El Conde Lucanor, which has tons of Arabic material in it, if you're interested, even Arabic transliterated in Spanish letters. So it's really a fascinating, and he wrote, not in the book of stories, but he wrote sort of objecting to this practice. He said that, there at these vigils, songs are being sung, instruments are played, stories are told, and positions are taken, se ponen posturas. I think that might refer to dances, all of which are contrary to the reason that the vigils were organized. So this is in the early 14th century, And 2 centuries later, we still have people, Juan de Malara is still lamenting that the populace, have vigils in churches where they bring in, singers and musicians, and they listen to vulgar songs, and they engage in dances and comidas, meals or comedies, and other contemptible behaviors. So this idea of bringing, Jewish and Muslim minstrels into the church for these vigils went on for a very long time. Another interesting thing that I had never even imagined is that it turns out that many different municipalities, that is city governments, hired Muslim and Jewish musicians to be their salaried musicians alongside Christian musicians. So it's not a case of sort of a caste structure where we say, oh, well, being a professional musician is not a high level occupation, so we'll have the Muslims and the Jews do this. No, they're alongside Christians. And perhaps the greatest study is of the city of Villarreal, or Villarreal now, a Christian urban center in the middle of a Muslim majority region, founded by Jaume I in 1274. And one Spanish scholar, Aparici, has shown that city financial records show that 50 Muslim musicians, 47 men and 3 women, were hired on a salaried basis during the 15th century, which is just extraordinary. Many of them performed what we call acclamatory or ceremonial music, that is fanfares on trumpets and drums and all that sort of thing. But others are on woodwind instruments and cornemusas, which is a very small bagpipe, and dulzainas, which is a type of oboe. And some of them were singers and listed as juglares, minstrels, so that may have sung and performed on musical instruments. It's a little bit all over Spain. So this is just the best example that I know of. And another thing is that Muslim men seem to have created this special niche for themselves by becoming professional trumpeters. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. Ali Shadid was hired as a trumpeter in Lerida with a year-long contract, along with a Christian trumpeter, in 1407, and he was still on the payroll in 1410. In the city of Tortosa, most of the Muslim musicians were hired as municipal trumpeters, and it's what you might not realize is that the head trumpeter of a city had actually a major role in organizing festivities and processions with the municipal authorities. So the head trumpeter was almost all, I don't know of a single example of a Muslim having that position, was a Christian, but he hired Muslim trumpeters. There was this very interesting thing where apparently in Spain and somewhat in Sicily as well, that Muslims announced prayer not with the adhan, but with trumpets. We can go into that a little bit later. Anyway, so just to let you know, these are famous images from the illustrated versions of the maqamat. This is the long trumpet, the anafil, or nafir in Arabic, which as anfar or anafir may be the root of the English word fanfare, fanfaron, and in various different European languages. And then here's an image of the sort of short trumpets that the Spaniards called trompa. Okay, so another position is processions. And there is a huge amount of documentation about processions in Spain. If you've ever been to Spain, especially in Semana Santa, you know Spain is all about processions and carrying huge images of the Virgin Mary and saints and things like that. This goes back centuries, of course. And scholars have, argued about whether the Jews and Muslims who were participants in these processions, was this sort of an act of humiliation to publicize their subjugated status, or were they just to sort of demonstrate, the variety, liven things up? And I think there's no one answer. I think there may be times where it was to show their subjugated status, but I think there are other times, and here's an example, where it's just that Muslims and Jews were professional musicians, and we wanted to have as much, if you're having a parade, you want as much lively music and dancing. And there is also a tradition of asking Moors and Jews to dance, and in these processions, las danzas. So here is a request from the man who's the head of the 1425 Corpus Christi procession in Murcia. He says to comb the Moors Moorish quarters, go into the Morerias and look for musicians. And so he sends a letter saying that he sent to all of the Moorish quarters so that the most minstrels, juglares, possible, be eager to participate in this celebration. If you're asking a juglar, a minstrel, to perform, I'm not sure that this is an act of sort of public humiliation. It might well be more that they do good music, lively music, and you're adding them to the festivities, but it's hard to tell. One couple of last examples. We, strangely enough, from the Inquisition records, and this is wonderful work done by Eliezer Gutwirt, that we can see the presence of Muslim and Jewish and Christian musicians crossing over, especially out in the countryside and in villages and in small towns, not the big cities. But from Sigüenza, from 1492 to 1504, we have a remarkable portrait of intercommunal music making and dancing at the level of village weddings and other festivities. Of course, if you've ever worked with Inquisition records, the thing that they are most astonishing about is the detail. So we have the actual confessions, and this is, of 18 Christians, 16 women, and 2 men of having danced at Jewish weddings. And it's interesting that as many more women have danced at Jewish weddings than men, or maybe more women were confessing to this. We also have records from Saragossa that gives us the names of Christian musicians who performed at Jewish and Muslim weddings. Francisco performed at both Jewish and Muslim weddings. Juan de Saragossa played flute at a Jewish wedding in the village of Pino, and Truboulet performed tambourine at a Jewish wedding. And these records go all the way down to who danced with whom by name, and their age and their religion. So it's just an astonishing record of all of this happening out basically in the countryside. And one of the ones that really caught my eye is that in 1462, the Jew Fischel hired Christian musicians, including the aforementioned Truboulet and Juan de Prados, to perform for the arrival of a new Torah at the local synagogue. So wow, this is sort of mind-blowing. We have a small Jewish community, and presumably we don't have Jewish musicians around to perform. So or maybe all of the Jewish men would be part of the ceremony and shouldn't be performing music. For whatever reason, they had to hire in Christian musicians for this occasion, the arrival of a new Torah. So, given the many references to musicians playing at weddings of various groups and across, religious boundaries, sectarian boundaries, are we to assume that professional, full or part-time musicians knew different repertory? Or is this an indication that there was, at least in the countryside, possibly in the cities, a shared musical tradition? I should say, from the ethnomusicological point of view, both of these are completely possible. We have many examples of where a professional musician has to know the different repertories of his different audiences. So you play this for this group, you play that for that group, and it can be even within one ethnicity. So the wonderful Armenian musician in California, John Belzikian, told Scott Marcus and myself, he was talking about how when he performed at Armenian weddings, he always had to make sure which villages people were from, because although the name of a song would be the same, if you performed it the way another village knew that song, you would get a bad reception. And if you performed it the way people of this village back in Armenia know the song, you'd get a good reception. And so professionals, musicians are professional crowd pleasers. That is how you survive. That's how you make money. But it also could be that, quite frankly, at the local level, it wasn't so much that there was Jewish music, Muslim music, Christian music, but sort of a shared tradition, especially if people are dancing. So we don't really, can't tell which of these. Finally, let me just talk about Morisco music. So, of course, in the early 16th century, the Jews had been expelled in 1492, although conversos and marranos, converts, were still around who had converted to Christianity, and the Muslim population was forced to convert to Christianity as well. In 1526, a series of laws trying to, if you will, purify the Morisco population of their Muslim or Arab traditions, prohibited clothing and owning Arabic books and things like that. But it also included a law prohibiting the musical gatherings of Moriscos that are called Leilas y Samras, right, in Granada. And amazingly, the Moriscos appealed directly to Queen Isabella of Portugal, that is the wife of Carlos V, of Carlos V. And she in turn wrote to the church authorities in Granada in 1530, asking for an explanation why this prohibition was being levied against her loyal subjects. And in 1532, the church authorities had to respond, but she rejected their arguments. And so Morisco Arab Muslim music continued on for many decades. Here is an image from the famous Trachtenbuch, the book of costumes by a German who was traveling around Europe and North Africa. And these are the Moriscos, and you can see they do have a very distinctive costume. And more than that, they are performing very distinctive musical instruments. This type of drum with the curved stick, this what perhaps is a metal ring, being sort of a form of cymbal or triangle. And then what we can clearly see is a type of fiddle being played across the chest. And there are these two little inscriptions, and they are, this is how the Moriscos dance, quickly snapping their fingers, and this is the Morisco dance game, during which they cry out like calves. So perhaps not an appreciation of Morisco singing. So there was a brief rebellion that captured a part of the Alpujarras Mountains south of Granada, and one of the most detailed descriptions of Morisco music and dance is provided in the account of the Morisco Rebellion by Pérez de Ita. He gives an account of a celebration in the mountains in this sort of independent kingdom that's fighting off the Christian armies. And he gives this great description of all the singing and dancing and music. It's very clear that he thought it was great fun living among the Moriscos because they had so much music. And remarkably, even in the midst of this armed rebellion, where there are battles being fought on this almost weekly basis, at one of these celebrations, there were prizes being given out to the best dancer of the Zambra, a female prize and a male prize, and the best musicians and the best singer, a male prize and a female prize. So it's like, wow, you know, Morisco's got talent, you know, centuries before Britain or America ever thought of it. Anyway, so it's really a fascinating description. And then finally, we have this astonishing you know, thing that, and I refer you to Javier Irigoyen Garcia's book called Moors Dressed as Moors. And that is that as the Christians began to take over these formerly Muslim territories, they took on a lot of different things. And you can look at Barbara Fuchs' book, Morophilia, for other examples. She ties it to bullfights and all sorts of things. But there was this game of essentially equestrian skill. This is about fancy horseback riding that was called Los Juegos de Cañas. And participants they threw sort of spears, light spears at each other, but mainly they rode their horses in complicated, highly choreographed patterns around the ring. But they were expected to dress as Moors, a la Morisca, in leather boots, wear a Moorish tunic and cape, marlota y capellar, a turban, and to carry a leather shield, a darga, which is still a word in modern Spanish, which is from the Arabic daraqa. And they toss light spears at each other and riding through these things. And they were supposed to shout in a manner that was presumed to sound Moorish. So if you want to, luckily we have these great, you know, period drawings. So here we go. This is a Christian dressed up as a Moor participating in the Juegos de Cañas. But there were also Moors that rode. So this actually could be a Morisco. But here's one person. And then here's this very famous, huge painting. It's quite large, you know, that demonstrates one of these events. And, you know, there's really, with any of these big paintings, you can zoom in and find all sorts of fascinating things. But part of it was or let's say, one interesting note that that Irigoyen Garcia points out, that the game of canes was so widespread that there were laws, regulations in different regions of Spain requiring that any tailor or leather worker who became certified, who became a master at his trade, had to prove that they were skilled at creating the required Morisca costumes used in the game of canes. Right, so it actually impacted tailors and leather workers across Spain. Part of the spectacle was that these games were accompanied by Moorish music, described by one writer, a Spanish writer, as sones moriscos, although in fact we don't know what they were actually playing. It could have been sort of an orientalizing, this is what Moorish music sounds like. They could have been using Moors as musicians. We just don't know. But here in the corner of this painting, we can see these drummers, for example, but we know that there were other musical instruments involved as well. And then a final gasp after the actual expulsion. There is this horribly racist justification of the expulsion. And there's one little chapter here which I dearly love, because the very virtuous Catholic author is saying we had to kick the Moriscos out for various different reasons. And one of them is that Moriscos are addicted to musical gathering, leilas y sambras, raucous entertainment, storytelling, dancing, including the sambra and the sarabanda, singing, promenading through gardens, and bestial activities accompanied by screaming through the streets. And then he lists all the different musical instruments. And what is absolutely wonderful for me as a scholar, historian of this is a richer description of music than we have from any of the Arabic sources. So this man who is sort of, this racist tirade about why we had to kick the Moriscos out, clearly they had to kick the Moriscos out because they were having too much fun. They were dancing and performing music and singing. We can't have that in our good, pure Catholic Spain, can we? So here's the main idea from this, and that is that the many descriptions and images of Muslim and Jewish musicians and dancers performing in Christian courts, churches, municipalities, processions, weddings, and other contexts offer a much richer and more diverse portrait of musical life than is found in Arabic sources. But, there are lots of open questions. When these Muslim and Jewish musicians, performed in these Christian contexts, were they overtly marked and perceived as Muslims and Jews, or were they simply hired musicians, wedding musicians? If you had did it make any difference if it was a Muslim trumpeter or a Christian trumpeter announcing the arrival of a famous guest? Did they perform repertoire that was recognizably Andalusi, that is derived from the diverse Arabic and Hebrew musical traditions of Al-Andalus, or did they adopt the musical repertoire of Christians? If they played Andalusi music, was that appreciated as music, or was it just a bit of exotica, to put them on show? I don't know, the way blackface, vaudeville or something like that was done. What can the presence of these musicians behind the enemy lines tell us about cultural exchange and or communal identities? And I will stop there. Hope that I have not gone too long. But that is a glimpse at the remarkable amount of documentation that we find for Muslim and Jewish musicians, drawing from Christian sources rather than Arabic sources. And for me, of course, they provide a wonderful complement to add to what we know from our Arabic sources. I thank you for the goodness of your listening. Bon, do you handle questions?
Yes. So thank you very much, Dwight, indeed, for this fantastic fanfare. What you gave us. Yes, and we will go to the question session. I will turn off the recording before, but before we do this, I don't want to forget to advertise our next talk next week, which will be delivered by Elizabeth, who is, I believe, in the audience. And it is on challenges of studying slavery in early Islamic history. So slavery was mentioned today, a very special slaves, and we will continue with this next week. So I will turn off the recording and invite everyone to ask your questions. And well, thank you again, Dwight. This was amazing.